The signal came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A single broadcast repeated across every channel the Galactic Concord used to talk to its member worlds. It was short, it was final, and it was the last thing humanity ever heard from the species that called themselves their allies. Humanity is hereby removed from the Concord. No assistance will be given. No ships will be sent. You are now beyond our concern. That was it. No explanation. No warning. Just a cold, clean cut, like a surgeon removing a tumor they were afraid might spread. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the ESV Resolute, staring at the message scrolling across the main screen for the third time. Around her, the bridge crew had gone silent, not the silence of shock, though there was plenty of that. This was the silence of people doing math in their heads, fast math, the kind that decided whether you lived or died. "Confirm the source," Chen said. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. "Confirmed, Admiral," said Lieutenant Okafor from the comm station. "It's from the Concord Central Authority. Verified encryption. Verified signature. This is real." "And the reason?" Okafor hesitated. "There isn't one given, just the order." Chen turned to her science officer, a woman named Priya Raman who had spent the last decade studying alien biology and Concord politics in equal measure. "Priya, talk to me. Why now? Why us?" Raman pulled up a star chart on her console, 3 systems glowing red near the edge of explored space. "The Valkyrie border conflict. We've been escorting refugee convoys through contested space for 6 months. The Valkyrie hegemony has been threatening retaliation against any species that interferes. And the Concord decided we weren't worth the fight," Chen said. "That's my read, yes." Silence again. Then a young ensign at navigation, barely 2 years out of the academy, spoke up without being asked. "Admiral, with respect, what are we going to do?" Chen looked at the young man. His name was Tomas Reyes, and he had a habit of asking the questions everyone else was too scared to say out loud. She liked that about him. "We're going to find out exactly how alone we are," Chen said, "and then we're going to decide what that means." 3 light-years away, on Earth, the news hit like a hammer. The United Earth government had built its entire defense doctrine around Concord membership for the last 40 years. Humanity had joined the galactic community eager and hopeful, a young species among ancient ones, grateful for the technology, the trade routes, the protection from threats they barely understood. Concord membership meant safety. It meant humanity was not alone in a galaxy full of things that could erase a civilization without much effort. Now that safety net was gone, and gone with no warning. In the underground command center beneath what used to be Geneva, President Amara Okonkwo sat through 6 hours of emergency briefings without once leaving her chair. Generals, diplomats, scientists, each one brought worse news than the last. "Our fleet cannot match a single Valkyrie battle group," said General Marcus Webb, head of Earth Defense Forces. He did not sugarcoat it, because Okonkwo had told him from day one she did not want sugar. "We have maybe 200 capital ships total, scattered across colonies and trade routes. The Valkyrie alone field over 1,000, and they're not even the most dangerous species out there, they're just the closest. What about the other Concord members? Surely some of them remember what we did for them," Okonkwo said. "The Thessaly evacuation, the plague cure we shared freely instead of selling it. We have allies." Webb's expression did not change. "We reached out to all of them in the last 6 hours. Every single one declined to respond, or responded with a polite refusal to get involved. They're scared, Madam President. If the Concord turned on us, they're worried they could be next. Nobody wants to stick their neck out." Okonkwo closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had hardened behind them. "Then we don't wait for anyone to stick their neck out for us. We protect our own. Madam President, with the forces we have. I'm not talking about winning a war with the forces we have, General. I'm talking about what we do next. Convene every shipyard director, every colony governor, every scientist, with a security clearance above level 4. We meet again in 12 hours. I want options, not problems." The order rippled outward across human space within a day. Every colony, every outpost, every ship received the same transmission. The Concord had abandoned them, and Earth was now standing alone. On New Shenzhen, a mining colony on the edge of the Valkyrie border, the reaction was not panic. It was something else entirely. Wei Lin had grown up on that colony, the daughter of 2 engineers who had left Earth 30 years earlier to build something new out in the dark. She was 26 now, running the colony's defense network. And when the broadcast came through, she did not cry or scream. She walked straight to the colony's central plaza, where a crowd was already gathering, faces lit by the dim glow of the system's distant red star. "They think we're done," she said, standing on the steps of the colony hall, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "They think because nobody's coming to save us, we're going to lie down and die quiet." Nobody answered. They were listening. "My parents built this colony with their hands. We dug into rock that nobody else wanted, on the edge of space that nobody else would touch, because Earth gave us the will to do it even when nobody else believed in us. We didn't ask the Concord for permission to survive then. We're not asking now." A murmur ran through the crowd, something between fear and resolve, the two feelings tangled together in every throat. "So here's what we're going to do," Weylin continued. "We're going to fortify. We're going to build. We're going to remember that humanity has never once, not one single time in our entire history, needed someone else's permission to keep fighting." The crowd's silence broke into something louder. Not a cheer, not yet, but a sound that carried weight, the sound of people deciding together that they would not go quietly. Back on the Resolute, Admiral Chen received new orders 3 days later. They came not from the Concord, who had washed their hands of Earth completely, but from Earth itself, under a new designation, the Unified Human Defense Initiative. The orders were simple, and they chilled her more than the original abandonment message had. Withdraw all human ships from contested space immediately. Consolidate forces at Sol System and the 4 core colonies. Prepare for the possibility of total isolation. "They're pulling everyone back," Chen said quietly, reading the orders a second time. "Every ship, every colony beyond the Core 4. They're drawing a line and saying anything outside it might be lost." Raman looked up sharply. "New Shenzhen is outside that line." "Admiral, so is Tau Ceti Colony, so is Hawking's Reach. That's almost 2 million people." "I know. We can't just leave them." Chen stood, walking to the viewport, looking out at the stars that no longer felt friendly. Somewhere out there, the Velkari fleet was likely already moving, testing the new boundaries of a galaxy where humanity had no protector but itself. "We're not leaving them," Chen said finally. "I didn't say we'd follow the order." Reyes, still at navigation, turned in his seat. "Admiral, that's mutiny." "It's not mutiny if Earth Command agrees with me," Chen said. She turned to Okafor. "Get me a direct line to President Okonkwo. Tell her Admiral Chen has a proposal, and it starts with this. We don't abandon our own people just because the galaxy abandoned us first." The proposal reached Okonkwo within the hour, and she read it twice before calling an emergency session of her cabinet. Chen's plan was bold, dangerously so. Instead of consolidating into a defensive shell around Earth, she wanted to establish what she called the Promise Line, a network of rapid response fleets stationed to protect every human settlement, no matter how distant or small. "It spreads our forces thin," General Webb argued during the session. "If the Velkari hit us with everything they have, we won't be able to concentrate defense anywhere. And if we pull back to the core systems, we tell every human colony out there that they don't matter," Okonkwo said. "We tell them exactly what the Concord told us. That's not who we are. With respect, Madam President, survival comes first." Okonkwo looked around the table, at the tired faces of people who had spent 3 days without proper sleep, trying to chart a course through a crisis none of them had ever trained for. "Survival as what, General? As a species that protects its strongest and discards the weak? Or as a species that means it when we say nobody stands alone?" Nobody answered immediately. Outside the underground chamber, somewhere far above, the sun was setting over a planet that had just learned it had no friends among the stars. "We adopt Admiral Chen's plan," Okonkwo said finally. "Every colony, every outpost, every ship full of human beings gets defended like it's the capital itself. We don't have the Concord's resources, we don't have their technology, but we have something they apparently forgot how to value." "What's that?" Webb asked. "Each other," Okonkwo said. "Send the order. The Promise Line begins today." Far beyond the edges of explored human space, in a region of the galaxy the Concord rarely bothered to map, something old was stirring. It had felt the shift in the balance of power, the sudden withdrawal of protection around a small, struggling species that called itself humanity. It had been waiting a long time for an opportunity like this. The Velkari hegemony was not the only threat in the dark. It was simply the closest one, the first domino in a line that stretched back into history humans had never been told about. History the Concorde had kept hidden for reasons of their own. Humanity did not know yet what was coming. They only knew they were alone, and that the galaxy expected them to fall. What the galaxy did not understand, what it had never bothered to learn in its decades of polite alliance with Earth, was that humans had a very particular relationship with being told they were doomed. They tended to disagree. On 100 worlds and 1,000 ships, the message went out and took root in human hearts. No one was coming to save them, so they would save themselves, and each other, and anyone who could not save themselves alone. The promised line had begun. The galaxy had no idea what it had just unleashed. The Velkhari battle group reached the edge of New Shenzhen's system 11 days after the Concorde cut humanity loose. 23 warships, sleek and black, moving in formation that spoke of decades of practiced war. They did not announce themselves. They did not need to. Their sensors had already mapped the colony's defenses, and what they found made the Velkhari commander, a war-bred officer named Trega Voss, almost laugh. 12 defense platforms, outdated shield generators, a single squadron of patrol craft that would have struggled against a determined pirate raid, let alone a hegemony war fleet. "This will not take long," Voss said to his second-in-command, watching the sensor display from the bridge of his flagship, the Hollow Talon. "Signal the colony. Tell them to surrender their mining operations and their territory, or we reduce the colony to debris." The signal went out. On New Shenzhen, in the colony's command center buried 300 meters beneath the surface, Wei Lin received it with a tightness in her chest that she did not let show on her face. "They want surrender," she said to the room. "Full territorial concession, or they open fire in 1 hour." Around her, the colony's defense council looked at each other with the particular fear of people who knew exactly how outmatched they were. New Shenzhen had 40,000 residents. It had no military to speak of, just civilian engineers and miners who had spent the last 11 days bolting together whatever defenses they could improvise. "We don't have a choice," said one of the council members, an older man named Director Okonjo. "We surrender. We survive to fight another day." "And then what?" Wei Lin asked. "They take the colony. They take the mining output. They take whatever they want from 40,000 people who can't fight back. That's not surviving. That's just dying slower." Before Okonjo could respond, the comm board lit up with an incoming transmission, not from the Velkhari fleet, but from somewhere deeper in human space. Wei Lin answered it, and Admiral Sarah Chen's face appeared on the screen, calm and sharp-eyed. "This is the ESV Resolute, leading Task Force Hammer. 3 hours out from your position," Chen said. "Do not surrender. Do not negotiate. Hold your defenses and buy us time. We are coming." Wei Lin felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. "Admiral, with respect, they're giving us 1 hour. You're 3 hours out." "I know," Chen said, "which means you need to make 1 hour look a lot longer than it is." The hour Voss gave New Shenzhen ran out, and the colony's answer came back not as a surrender, but as silence. Voss took the silence as defiance, which it was, and ordered the Hollow Talon to open fire on the colony's outer defense platforms. What he did not expect was the resistance. New Shenzhen's defenses had been quietly upgraded in the 11 days since the abandonment, not by any official military supply chain, since there hadn't been time for that, but by the colony's own engineers, working without sleep, repurposing mining equipment into makeshift weapons. Plasma cutters meant for asteroid extraction had been retooled into short-range defense lasers. Mining drones, hundreds of them, had been converted into kamikaze interceptors, cheap and expendable and numerous enough to overwhelm point defense systems through sheer volume. The first wave of Velkhari fighters hit a wall of drone swarms that no sensor reading had predicted, and 3 fighters went down in the opening exchange. Voss, watching from the Hollow Talon's bridge, felt his confidence crack just slightly. "Recalibrate point defense for the drone pattern," he ordered, "and bring the capital ships in closer. End this." The capital ships moved in, and New Shenzhen's outer platforms began to fail one by one under their fire, but the colony did not break. Every platform that went dark, the engineers had already wired with self-destruct charges, turning the wreckage itself into a hazard field that slowed the Velkhari advance even further. Wei Lin stood in the command center, watching the battle unfold on the main display, her hands steady on the console even as the platforms she had helped build went dark one after another. "They're burning through our defenses, but they're burning through their own ammunition and patience too," she said to the room. Every minute we hold, we're buying the fleet more time to arrive. Keep the drones moving. Keep the wreckage field active. We don't need to win, we need to survive. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the first shot was fired, Task Force Hammer dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the system, 12 ships strong, far smaller than the Valkyrie force but moving with a speed and precision that suggested they had not come to negotiate. Admiral Chen's voice came across the open channel to the entire battle space, Valkyrie and human alike. Valkyrie Fleet, this is Task Force Hammer of the Unified Human Defense Initiative. You are engaging a protected human settlement. Withdraw now, or we will consider this an act of war against the entirety of humanity. Voss, watching the new arrivals on his sensor display, laughed out loud. 12 ships against his 23, against a fleet that had already worn down most of the colony's defenses. Humanity has no fleet capable of threatening the hegemony. This is a desperate bluff. It's not a bluff, Chen said. It's a promise. We made it to every human colony in this galaxy. Nobody stands alone. You're about to find out we meant it. Task Force Hammer engaged. What followed was not a battle that should have made sense by the numbers. The Valkyrie ships were larger, more numerous, built by a species with centuries more combat experience than humanity had ever accumulated. But Chen's task force had spent the last 11 days doing what New Shenzhen had done on a smaller scale, refusing to accept the limits the galaxy had handed them. Reyes, at navigation on the Resolute, threaded the ship through gaps in the Valkyrie formation that no sane tactical computer would have recommended. Gaps that existed only because human pilots had started flying with an aggression the Valkyrie battle computers hadn't modeled. Raman's science team had spent the transit time reverse engineering captured Valkyrie sensor data from old border skirmishes, finding blind spots in their targeting systems that human ships now exploited ruthlessly. It was not a clean victory. 3 human ships took heavy damage. One, the destroyer Liberty's Watch, lost half its crew when a Valkyrie plasma lance tore through its shields. But the Valkyrie fleet, expecting an easy massacre, found themselves bleeding ships at a rate their commander had never planned for. Voss watched 4 of his capital ships go dark in the span of 20 minutes, watched his fighter screens collapse under coordinated human assault patterns that should not have existed 11 days after a species lost its only protector. Something cold settled into his chest, the particular fear of a predator who has just realized the prey was never actually weak, only unprepared. Withdraw, he said finally, the word tasting like ash. Full retreat. We will report this to Hegemony Command. The remaining Valkyrie ships pulled back, jumping to slipspace and vanishing from the system, leaving behind wreckage and a colony that had just survived its first taste of a galaxy that wanted it dead. On New Shenzhen, the cheering started before the Resolute had even finished its approach to the colony. Wei Lin stood in the command center, watching the Valkyrie fleet's retreat on the main display, and allowed herself, for the first time in 11 days. Director Okonjo placed a hand on her shoulder. You held the line. We held the line, she corrected. All of us, the drones, the engineers, the people who didn't run when they could have. Hours later, when Chen's shuttle landed on the colony's surface and the Admiral walked out to meet the colony's defense council in person, Wei Lin was the first to greet her. You actually came, Wei Lin said, still half in disbelief. I told you we would, Chen said. The promise line isn't a slogan. It's the only thing we have left that the galaxy can't take from us. Every colony, every ship, every person. We don't leave anyone behind. Not because we're strong enough to guarantee it, but because the alternative is becoming exactly what the Concord already proved they are. Wei Lin looked past the Admiral, at the wreckage still drifting in high orbit, the burned-out shells of Valkyrie fighters, mixed with the remains of New Shenzhen's improvised defenses. What happens now? They'll come back. Bigger, this time. Probably, Chen admitted. But now they know something they didn't know 11 days ago. Humanity doesn't fold just because we're outnumbered. And word travels fast in a galaxy this connected. Every species watching is going to recalculate what it costs to attack us. News of the New Shenzhen engagement spread through the Valkyrie hegemony within days, and from there, through trade channels and diplomatic back channels, to the rest of the Concord. The reaction was not what Earth expected. In the Concord Central Authority, a towering structure of glass and light orbiting the species' founding world, representatives gathered in emergency session to discuss what had happened. The Valkyrie ambassador, a being named Korsun, addressed the chamber with barely restrained fury. We expelled humanity from this Concord 11 days ago specifically to avoid this exact situation, Korsun said, and now they have engaged and repelled a hegemony battle group with a fraction of the forces they should have required. This was not supposed to happen. A representative from the Tasari Compact, one of the founding species of the Concord, spoke next, her voice measured and careful. Perhaps the assessment of humanity's threat capability was flawed from the start. We removed them based on political convenience, not military analysis. They were removed because protecting them was becoming too costly, said another voice, this one belonging to the Concord's presiding administrator, an ancient being named Thesson Vale, who had overseen Concord policy for longer than humanity had existed as a spacefaring species. The decision stands. Humanity's internal capacity for self-defense is not our concern. What concerns me is the precedent. If they successfully resist hegemony aggression without our support, other smaller member species may begin to question why they continue paying the costs of Concord membership at all. The chamber fell quiet at that, the real fear finally spoken aloud. It was never really about humanity's safety. It was about control, about the Concord's grip on the smaller species who depended on it, a grip that a successful independent humanity threatened to loosen. Then we make certain this does not become a pattern, Korsun said. The hegemony will return to New Shenzhen with overwhelming force. This time, there will be no survivors to inspire anyone else's defiance. Back in Sol System, President Okonkwo received the full battle report from Admiral Chen alongside an intelligence briefing that made her blood run cold. Concord communications, intercepted through channels Earth still maintained from its years of membership, suggested the hegemony was already planning a second assault on New Shenzhen, this time with a force 5 times larger. They're not just trying to win, Okonkwo said, reading the intercepted intelligence in her office, General Webb standing across from her. They're trying to make an example, prove that resisting them costs more than it's worth. Then we make sure the cost is even higher, Webb said. Admiral Chen's tactics worked once. We refine them, scale them up, and we hold New Shenzhen no matter what they send. Okonkwo nodded slowly, looking out at the image of Earth on her office wall, blue and fragile, and utterly alone in a galaxy that had decided it did not need to care anymore. Send everything we have to spare. Every ship, every pilot, every engineer who can build a weapon out of mining equipment in 11 days. If the galaxy wants to make an example out of us, we're going to make sure it's the wrong kind. Far above the planet, in orbit around a world that had just discovered exactly how much fight it had left in it, humanity's fleet began to gather. The first battle had been a desperate improvisation, a colony's last stand bought with 11 days and willpower alone. The second battle, everyone in that gathering fleet understood, would decide something much larger than the fate of one mining colony. It would decide whether the galaxy's assumption about humanity, that they were weak, disposable, and easily erased, was about to become permanently, violently wrong. 16 days after the Concord cut humanity loose, the Velkari hegemony returned to New Shenzhen with a fleet that made the first assault look like a probing scout. 112 warships dropped out of slip space at the edge of the system, their formations stretching across half the available sensor range. Among them, 3 vessels the hegemony had never deployed in a border conflict before, Dreadnought-class carriers, each one capable of fielding enough fighters to blot out a sky. On the Resolute, now serving as the flagship of a hastily expanded human fleet called Task Force Anchor, Admiral Chen watched the sensor readout populate with red icons until the screen looked less like a battle map and more like a wound. "That's not a punitive strike," Raman said quietly, standing at her science station. "That's an extermination order." "They're sending a message," Chen said. "Resist us, and this is what it costs." Behind her, the bridge had gone quiet in a way that was different from the silence 16 days earlier, when the Concord's abandonment message first hit. This silence had weight to it, the weight of people who understood exactly what they were looking at, and had chosen to stay anyway. Tomas Reyes broke it first. "Admiral, our fleet is 41 ships. They've got over 100. Even with the New Shenzhen defenses factored in, the math doesn't work." "I know what the math says," Chen replied. "I'm not interested in what the math says. I'm interested in what we do about it." She turned to the bridge at large, and for a moment her voice carried not just to her crew but, through the open channel Okafor had quietly established, to every ship in the fleet and every soul on New Shenzhen's surface. 11 days ago, This colony held a line against a battle group that should have erased them in an hour. They held it because they refused to accept that they were already dead. Today, the hegemony brought everything they have because we hurt their pride and threatened their control. They want to make an example of us. She paused, letting the words settle. So let's give them an example. Let's give every species watching from the dark a very clear lesson about what happens when you try to bury humanity alive. A cheer went up across the open channel, ragged and fierce, the sound of 41 ships' worth of crews who had spent 16 days preparing for exactly this moment. On the surface of New Shenzhen, Wei Lin stood in the same command center where she had watched the first battle unfold, except now the room was full. Engineers, miners, off-duty defense personnel, and a cluster of newly arrived volunteers from neighboring colonies who had heard about the first stand and refused to sit it out, all crowded around monitors and consoles that had been rebuilt and reinforced in the days since. "We've tripled the drone production," said an engineer named Marcus Oduya, pulling up the latest inventory on the main display. "We've also got something new. Director Okonjo's team found a way to weaponize the colony's ore refinement lasers. They're slow to charge, but when they fire, they punch through Velkari shielding like it isn't there." "How many?" Wei Lin asked. 6. "We had to gut half the colony's industrial output to build them in time." "Then we make every shot count." Wei Lin looked around the room at the faces gathered there, tired and frightened and resolved all at once. "This isn't a mining colony anymore. As of today, we're a fortress. Let's act like one." The battle began with the Velkari dreadnoughts launching their fighter wings in a single overwhelming wave, thousands of small craft screaming toward the human fleet and the colony's defenses, in a formation designed to simply drown every available point defense system through sheer numbers. Admiral Chen had expected exactly this. "Execute pattern hollow," she ordered, and across the human fleet, ships that had spent 16 days drilling a tactic born from desperation and innovation, in equal measure, began to move. Instead of meeting the fighter swarm head-on, the human fleet split into smaller, faster formations, weaving through the edges of the swarm rather than absorbing it directly, using New Shenzhen's drone network as a secondary wall that the Velkari fighters had to fight through before ever reaching the capital ships. It cost them. 2 human frigates were overwhelmed in the opening minutes, their crews evacuating to escape pods as the ships went dark, but the strategy bought something precious: time, and the chance to thin the fighter swarm before the Velkari capital ships closed the distance. On New Shenzhen's surface, the 6 refinement lasers fired in sequence, each one taking nearly 90 seconds to recharge, but punching clean through the shields of anything they hit. The first shot tore through a Velkari cruiser's engine section, leaving it dead in space, a target the human fleet's smaller ships swarmed and finished within minutes. Voss, watching from the hollow talon, felt the cold certainty he had carried into this engagement begin to crack for the second time in 16 days. "They've adapted," he said to his second-in-command, disbelief coloring his voice. An entire colony reorganized its industrial capacity around weapons design in under 3 weeks. "Orders, Commander? Bring the dreadnoughts forward. End this with overwhelming force before they adapt any further." The 3 dreadnoughts advanced, their massive forms eclipsing the smaller ships around them, weapons batteries charging with enough power to glass the colony's surface in a single coordinated strike. Chen saw the formation shift on her tactical display and understood immediately what it meant. "They're going for the colony directly," she said. "They're done trying to win the fleet engagement. They want to erase New Shenzhen and call it a victory regardless of what happens to their ships." "Admiral, we can't intercept all 3 dreadnoughts with what we have left," Okafor reported, voice tight. "We've lost 6 ships. We're down to 35 against 106, and they're bringing the heaviest weapons in their arsenal straight at civilians." Chen's hands tightened on the edge of her console. This was the moment, she understood, that would define everything. Not the battle's outcome in numbers, but the choice in front of her. "Concentrate everything we have on the lead dreadnought," she ordered. "Reyes, plot an intercept course. We're not letting them reach the colony." "Admiral, that's a collision course with a ship 40 times our mass," Reyes said. "I know exactly what it is, Lieutenant. Plot it anyway." What followed would be studied by tacticians across human space for generations afterward, not because it was elegant, but because it was the rawest possible expression of a species refusing to let the people it had promised to protect become a statistic. The Resolute, along with 11 other human ships, drove directly into the path of the lead Velkari dreadnought, weapons fire concentrated with a precision born of shared desperation rather than superior technology. The dreadnought's shields, designed to withstand sustained bombardment from dozens of smaller craft over time, had never been tested against this kind of focused immediate assault. The shields failed 40 seconds before the dreadnought's main weapons batteries would have fired on New Shenzhen's surface. The second wave of human fire tore into the dreadnought's exposed hull, and Voss watched in real time as the ship that was supposed to end this conflict in a single devastating strike instead began to die, internal explosions rippling along its length as critical systems failed one after another. On New Shenzhen, Wei Lin watched the dreadnought's destruction on the command center's main display, the massive ship breaking apart in a silent, distant fireball that nonetheless felt close enough to touch. Around her, the room erupted, not in celebration yet, because the battle was far from over, but in something fiercer: belief. They held it, Marcus Oduya breathed. They actually held it. It's not over, Wei Lin said, though her own voice carried the same disbelief. 2 more dreadnoughts incoming. Keep the refinement lasers cycling. We're not done. Voss, watching his flagship's sensors confirm the loss of the lead dreadnought, felt something he had not expected to feel against a species the hegemony had dismissed as soft and dependent for decades. Respect, twisted and bitter, mixed with something closer to fear. Pull the remaining dreadnoughts back, he said finally. Concentrate fighter screens. We finish this with attrition, not a single overwhelming strike. They cannot have anticipated everything. But the human fleet, bloodied and reduced to barely 30 ships, had found something in the destruction of that dreadnought that no amount of Velkari recalibration could counter: momentum. Every ship that remained fought with the knowledge that the impossible had already happened once today. It could happen again. The battle ground on for 3 more hours, brutal and costly on both sides. Human casualties mounted. 3 more ships were lost, including the destroyer Hope's Anchor, whose entire crew Chen had personally promoted from cadets only 8 months earlier. But for every human ship lost, the Velkari fleet bled more, their numerical advantage eroding under the relentless, coordinated resistance of a species that simply refused to accept the outcome the math had predicted. When Voss finally gave the order to withdraw, his fleet numbered 61 ships, less than half of what he had brought to the system. The human fleet, battered and exhausted, numbered 26. By the brutal arithmetic of war, it should have been a Velkari victory. They had inflicted more losses than they suffered in raw numbers, technically speaking, but everyone on both sides of the engagement understood the truth that the numbers concealed. The hegemony had thrown everything at a single mining colony and a fraction of humanity's available fleet, and they had failed to take it. In the aftermath, as repair crews moved through the wreckage in New Shenzhen's orbit, and the colony's medical bays overflowed with wounded from both the fleet and the surface defense, Admiral Chen stood alone in the Resolute's observation deck, looking out at the stars and the debris field that marked where the battle had been won. Reyes found her there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of recycled coffee that tasted like burnt metal, but were the closest thing the ship had to comfort. "We held it, Admiral," he said, handing her one of the cups. "We held it," Chen agreed quietly, "at a cost. 9 ships, almost 300 crew. I don't know yet how many we lost on the surface." "It mattered, though," Reyes said, "didn't it?" Chen looked at him, this young officer who had asked the hard questions 16 days ago when the Concorde first abandoned them, and who had flown the Resolute directly into the path of a dreadnought without hesitation when she gave the order. "It mattered," she confirmed. "Today, every species watching this engagement learned something the Concorde tried very hard to make sure they never had to learn. Humanity doesn't need permission to survive. We don't need a protector, we need each other, and apparently, that's enough to make even the hegemony bleed." Far below them, on New Shenzhen's surface, Wei Lin stood in the wreckage of the colony's outer perimeter, looking up at the stars where the battle had raged, and understood that something fundamental had shifted, not just for her colony, but for every human settlement scattered across a galaxy that had just been forced to recalculate exactly what it meant to leave humanity for dead. The Concorde had expected silence. What they got instead was a fleet bloodied but unbroken, a colony scarred but standing, and a promise that had just proven, in the worst possible way, that it was not just words. Nobody stands alone. The galaxy was beginning to understand humanity meant it, no matter the cost. 3 weeks after the Battle of New Shenzhen, the footage reached every corner of Concorde space. despite the hegemony's best efforts to suppress it. A merchant trader, working routes along the contested border, had captured fragments of the engagement on long-range sensors and sold the data to anyone willing to pay. By the time the Concord Central Authority tried to control the narrative, it was already too late. Every member species had seen, in raw sensor data and grainy visual feeds, a human fleet a third the size of its attacker, driving a dreadnought into oblivion through sheer refusal to lose. The reaction across the galaxy was not unified. Some species reacted with renewed fear of humanity, a young, unpredictable race that had just demonstrated it could trade blows with an established military power and walk away standing. Others reacted with something more complicated: hope, quiet and dangerous, the kind that smaller Concord members had not allowed themselves to feel in a long time. On a world called Threnna, home to a small avian species called the Skarn who had been Concord members for over 2 centuries without ever once being treated as equals, a delegation gathered in secret to discuss what they had seen. They survived without the Concord, said Speaker Veleth, the eldest member of the delegation, her feathers ruffled with an agitation she rarely allowed herself to show in public. Not just survived, they fought back. They won, against forces that should have erased them in a single afternoon. The Velkari hegemony has always respected only strength, said a younger delegate, Corvin. If humanity can earn that respect through resistance, perhaps we have been thinking about our own situation incorrectly. You're suggesting the Skarn follow humanity's example, Veleth said. Reckless. The Concord could crush us as easily as they cast humanity aside. The Concord cast humanity aside specifically because keeping them was inconvenient, Corvin replied. We have been inconvenient to the hegemony's expansion for 15 years. How long before we become inconvenient to the Concord as well? The room fell silent. Nobody had an answer. But everyone understood the question had finally been spoken aloud, the question that humanity's defiance had forced into the open across a dozen worlds simultaneously. Back in Sol System, President Okonkwo faced a crisis of an entirely different shape. The cost of the promise line was becoming clear in ways that strained even Earth's considerable resolve. New Shenzhen's victory had bought breathing room, but the colony itself was devastated. Its industrial capacity gutted to build weapons in 11 days. Its population reduced by hundreds of casualties. Its infrastructure barely functional. And New Shenzhen was only one colony among dozens that humanity had pledged to protect. We cannot sustain this, General Webb said during the weekly defense briefing, his voice carrying none of the cautious optimism that had followed the battle's victory. We won at New Shenzhen, but at a cost we cannot repeat across every colony under threat. The hegemony has 31 other border settlements they could target next, and we have a fleet that's still rebuilding from losses we took defending just one. What's the alternative, General? Okonkwo asked, though she already suspected the answer and dreaded it. Prioritization, Webb said carefully. We can't defend every colony equally. We need to identify which settlements are strategically defensible and concentrate our resources there. The rest, he hesitated. The rest may need to be evacuated, or accept they're beyond what we can protect. Okonkwo felt the weight of the suggestion settle into the room like a physical thing. It was the same logic, dressed in different language, that the Concord had used to abandon humanity in the first place. Some lives were worth protecting, others were not. No, she said finally. Madam President. I said no, General. We made a promise, not a conditional one, not a when convenient one. If we start sorting our own people into worth saving and worth abandoning, we've already lost, regardless of what happens militarily. We become exactly what we're fighting against. Webb's jaw tightened, but he did not argue further. He had served long enough to recognize a decision that would not be unmade through debate. Then we need another path, Okonkwo continued. Not more ships, not yet. We don't have the shipyards to build them fast enough. We need allies, real ones, not the kind that abandon you the moment it becomes inconvenient. The Concord has made it clear nobody is willing to risk hegemony retaliation by openly supporting us, Webb said. Openly no, Okonkwo agreed. But I don't think every species in that Concord agrees with the decision to cast us aside. New Shenzhen proved something to the galaxy. I think it's time we found out exactly who was paying attention. The first contact came 8 days later, through a channel that should not have existed, encrypted using protocols Earth's intelligence division did not recognize. Admiral Chen, still overseeing repairs to her battered fleet in New Shenzhen's orbit, was the one who received it. The message was brief, and it came from the Skarn delegation on Threnna. We have watched what you did. We do not yet know if we have the courage to do the same. But we wished you to know that not every species in this galaxy believes the Concord's decision was just. If there is ever a way for our people to help yours without ending both of us, we would not refuse the chance. Chen read the message twice, before forwarding it directly to Earth Command, along with her own assessment. This isn't an alliance, she wrote in her report. Not yet, but it's a crack in the unity the Concord has been counting on. If the Skarn are willing to reach out quietly, others may follow. We should pursue this carefully, but we should pursue it. Okonkwo agreed, and within days, quiet diplomatic channels opened between Earth and a handful of smaller Concord species, none willing to declare open support, all of them watching humanity's continued resistance, with an interest that had not existed 3 weeks earlier. It was not the rescue humanity had hoped for when the Concord first cut them loose. It was something more fragile and more valuable, proof that the galaxy's fear of the hegemony and of the Concord's own willingness to discard inconvenient allies ran deeper than anyone had previously admitted. On New Shenzhen, Wei Lin had been promoted, unofficially at first, and then formally through Earth Command's new Colonial Defense Initiative, to oversee the Promise Line's frontline coordination for every settlement along the contested border. It was a role she had never trained for and had not asked for, but the colony's survival had marked her as someone who understood, in practical terms no military academy could teach, what it took to hold a line that should not have held. She spent her days now coordinating with a dozen other colony leaders, sharing the improvised defense techniques New Shenzhen had pioneered, helping settlements with a fraction of New Shenzhen's resources prepare for the possibility that the hegemony, humiliated by its defeat, might choose easier targets next. It was during one of these coordination calls that she first heard from Hawking's Reach, a small research colony 3 systems away that had been on Earth Command's list of settlements potentially too remote to defend. "We don't have your industrial capacity," said the colony's administrator, a tired-looking man named Dr. Felix Adeyemi. "We're a research station, not a mining operation. We don't have the equipment to convert into weapons the way you did. What do you have?" Wei Lin asked. "Data," Adeyemi said. "Years of research into Velkari technology, gathered from monitoring border skirmishes long before any of this started. We've never had a reason to share it because, frankly, nobody thought we were significant enough to bother protecting, so we kept our research close, hoping it might be valuable enough to make someone reconsider." Wei Lin felt something settle into place, the particular click of an idea that might actually matter. "Send it to Admiral Chen immediately. All of it." The data from Hawking's Reach turned out to be more valuable than anyone had anticipated. Buried in years of careful, underfunded research was a vulnerability in Velkari shield technology that the hegemony had never had reason to suspect anyone had discovered, a resonance frequency that, when properly targeted, could destabilize their shields far faster than conventional weapons fire. It was the same vulnerability, Raman realized when she reviewed the data on the Resolute, that had allowed the human fleet to crack the lead dreadnought's shields during the battle, though nobody had understood the underlying physics at the time. They had stumbled onto it through desperate trial and error. Hawking's Reach had found it through years of patient, unglamorous research that nobody had thought worth funding properly. "This changes everything," Raman told Chen, presenting the findings. "If we can refine our weapon systems to target this frequency directly, instead of relying on volume of fire, we level the playing field significantly. We don't need numerical superiority anymore. We need precision." Chen looked at the data, then at the report's origin. A colony that Earth Command had quietly considered indefensible, written off as a potential loss in the brutal calculations General Webb had proposed weeks earlier. A colony that, had Okonkwo agreed to that prioritization, might have been abandoned before it ever had the chance to hand humanity exactly the advantage it desperately needed. "Send my compliments to Dr. Adeyemi," Chen said, "and make sure Hawking's Reach gets priority defense resources from this point forward. They just earned it." The discovery spread through Earth Command's defense network within days, and weapons engineers across human space began the painstaking work of retrofitting existing systems to exploit the newfound vulnerability. It would not be ready in time for whatever the hegemony planned next, not fully, but it represented something Earth had not had since the Concord's abandonment. A genuine technological edge, earned not through superior resources, but through the kind of patient, unglamorous work that only existed because humanity had refused to abandon even its smallest, least defensible colonies. President Okonkwo received the full report in her office, reading it twice with something that, for the first time in weeks, resembled real hope rather than grim determination. "If we had followed General Webb's prioritization plan," she said quietly to her chief of staff, "Hawkins Reach would have been on the list of colonies we couldn't justify defending. We would have lost this entirely." "You made the right call, Madam President. I made the only call that didn't turn us into the Concorde," Okonkwo corrected. "There's a difference, and I think that difference might be the only real advantage we have left in this fight." Far across human space, on 100 different worlds and ships, the Promise Line continued to hold, fragile and costly, built on a principle the galaxy's most powerful species had abandoned generations ago, that worth was not measured in strategic value or resource output, but in the simple, stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind. It was, everyone now understood, the only thing standing between humanity and the same fate the Concorde had so casually assigned them 3 weeks earlier. And slowly, painfully, it was beginning to work. 6 weeks after the Concorde cut humanity loose, the Velkari hegemony made its decision known through the same cold, formal channels it had used to declare war in the first place. This time, the message was not addressed to a single colony or border outpost. It was addressed to Earth itself. Humanity's continued resistance has become an unacceptable disruption to hegemony interests along the contested border. We are mobilizing the 3rd and 5th battle fleets, combined strength of over 400 vessels, to end this conflict permanently. Surrender your border territories within 72 hours, or face complete and total destruction of your colonial holdings. Admiral Chen received the intercepted transmission aboard the Resolute, now fully repaired and serving as the anchor point for a human fleet that had grown, through 6 grueling weeks of round-the-clock shipbuilding and the technological breakthrough from Hawkins Reach, into something the hegemony had clearly not anticipated. 400 ships, Reyes said, reading the numbers off his console with a steadiness that would have been impossible 6 weeks earlier. That's their entire border deployment. They're not testing us anymore. They're ending this. Then we end it too, Chen said, one way or another. She called an emergency conference with Earth Command, and within hours, President Okonkwo, General Webb, and the full Council of Colonial Defense Coordinators, Wei Lin among them, were gathered across a secure channel that spanned half of human space. "This is the moment we've been preparing for since New Shenzhen," Okonkwo said, her voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had spent 6 weeks making peace with the possibility of catastrophic loss. "The hegemony wants to end this with overwhelming force. We don't have 400 ships. We have 160, including every colonial defense platform we've built since the Promise Line began. It's not enough by the old math," Chen said, "but we're not fighting by the old math anymore." Raman, present on the call as the lead architect of the resonance weapon refits, pulled up a tactical projection. "Every ship in our fleet has been retrofitted with the targeting systems based on the Hawkins Reach data. We can collapse Velkari shields in 1/3 of the time it took at New Shenzhen. It won't make us invincible, but it levels the field in a way the hegemony almost certainly hasn't accounted for." "There's something else," Wei Lin added, her voice carrying across the channel from New Shenzhen's command center, the colony rebuilt and reinforced since the battle that had nearly destroyed it. "We're not facing this fleet alone. The Skarn delegation reached out again yesterday. They're not offering combat support, not openly, but they've agreed to provide their entire sensor network along the border, real-time intelligence on hegemony fleet movements." 2 other species followed their lead within hours of the Skarn's offer going out quietly through diplomatic backchannels. Okonkwo absorbed this in silence for a moment. "The Concorde's grip is slipping. It's slipping because we proved it could be broken," Chen said. "Every colony we've held, every battle we've survived, it's been a crack in the idea that resistance against the hegemony, or against the Concorde itself, is impossible. We're not just fighting for our own survival anymore. Every species watching is deciding whether that fight is worth joining." The hegemony fleet arrived at the agreed deadline, 412 warships forming up at the edge of human space, the largest military force the Velkari had ever assembled for a single engagement. Commander Voss, who had personally requested to lead this final assault after the humiliation of New Shenzhen, stood on the bridge of a new flagship, the Absolute Reckoning, watching his sensor display fill with the full might of the hegemony's border forces. "This time, there will be no improvisation that saves them," he said to his staff. "We come with overwhelming numbers and total commitment. Humanity ends today." What Voss did not know, what his intelligence network had failed to detect despite weeks of trying, was that humanity's response fleet was not assembled in the open. waiting to be counted and assessed the way the hegemony expected. Instead, 160 human ships, along with hundreds of smaller defense platforms, had positioned themselves across a deliberately scattered formation, hidden among asteroid fields and the gravitational shadows of 3 different planets, waiting for a signal that would not come until the hegemony fleet had committed fully to its advance. The Skarn's sensor network, feeding real-time data through the quiet backchannel established weeks earlier, gave Chen something no previous human commander in this conflict had possessed: complete visibility into the hegemony's approach pattern, hours before they reached engagement range. "They're moving in a standard saturation formation," Chen said, reviewing the data on the Resolute's bridge. "They expect us to mass our defense around the core colonies and meet them head-on. They have no idea we've scattered." "It's a gamble," Reyes said. "If they adjust formation before we spring the trap, we lose the element of surprise entirely." "It's the only gamble that gives us a real chance," Chen replied. "We can't win a straight fight against 400 ships. We can win an ambush against a fleet that thinks it's facing a desperate, disorganized defense." The hegemony fleet advanced into what Voss believed was empty space between human defensive positions, confident in the overwhelming numerical advantage that had never failed the hegemony in its centuries of border conflicts. It was only when the fleet had fully committed to its advance, strung out across a wide formation optimized for maximum coverage rather than concentrated defense, that the trap closed. Human ships emerged from the asteroid fields and planetary shadows simultaneously, weapons already charged and targeting locked through the resonance frequency that the hegemony's shields had no defense against. The first volley alone disabled the shields of over 30 Velkari warships before they had even registered the ambush had begun. "All ships, concentrated fire on designated targets," Chen ordered, watching her tactical display transform from a desperate defensive scramble into something approaching genuine advantage. "Don't spread fire. Focus and collapse, one ship at a time. Make every shot count." The battle that followed was unlike anything either side had experienced in the 6 weeks of escalating conflict. The hegemony, caught in a formation built for overwhelming force rather than rapid reorganization, struggled to bring its full numerical advantage to bear against an enemy that refused to fight where expected. Human ships, smaller and individually weaker but armed with weapons calibrated to exploit a vulnerability the hegemony had never known existed, picked apart the scattered Velkari formation with a precision that turned the battle's mathematics inside out. Voss, watching his fleet's losses mount with an intensity that defied every tactical model his staff had prepared, felt the cold certainty of victory slip away for the third and final time. "Concentrate the fleet," he ordered, voice tight with controlled panic. "Form defensive clusters. Stop fighting their engagement. Force them to fight ours." But the order came too late. The hegemony's scattered formation, designed to overwhelm a static defense, had become a liability against an enemy fighting a mobile, coordinated ambush. Ships that tried to regroup found themselves isolated and vulnerable, picked off by human formations that had spent 6 weeks training specifically for this kind of fluid, decentralized engagement. 4 hours into the battle, with hegemony losses approaching 200 ships and human losses, while severe, numbering less than 40, Voss made the decision that would define the rest of the war. "All remaining forces, full withdrawal," he said, the words costing him more than any other order he had given in his military career. "We cannot sustain this engagement." The retreat order spread across the remaining hegemony fleet, and ships that had come to permanently end humanity's resistance instead scattered back toward hegemony territory, leaving behind a battlefield littered with wreckage that told a story the entire galaxy would soon hear in full. On the Resolute's bridge, the cheering that followed the confirmation of the hegemony's retreat was different from anything Chen had heard in the previous 6 weeks. It was not the relief of narrow survival. It was something closer to vindication, the sound of people who had refused an impossible fate and found, against every expectation the galaxy had set for them, that refusal had been enough. "Admiral," Okafor said, voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding, "Earth Command is requesting a direct line. President Okonkwo wants to speak with you personally." Chen accepted the channel, and Okonkwo's face appeared on the main display, the president's expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 6 hours believing she might be watching the destruction of everything she had sworn to protect. "Report, Admiral," Okonkwo said, though her voice already carried the answer she desperately hoped to hear. "The hegemony fleet is in full retreat," Chen said. "We held the line, Madam President. We held all of it." The aftermath of what would come to be known as the Battle of the Border, the largest engagement in humanity's brief and brutal 6 weeks of independence, rippled across Concord space with a force that no amount of hegemony censorship could contain. A fleet of 400 warships, the largest force the Velkari hegemony had ever assembled, had been turned back by a human defense numbering less than half its size, fighting with technology developed not through superior resources, but through the stubborn refusal to abandon even the smallest and least strategically valuable of their own people. The Skarn delegation, emboldened by the role their quiet intelligence support had played in the human victory, formally announced their withdrawal from Concord oversight within a week, the first species in over a century to openly challenge the Concord's authority. 3 other species followed within the month, each one citing humanity's resistance as proof that the Concord's claimed protection had always been conditional, always negotiable, and never truly guaranteed. The Concord Central Authority, faced with the unraveling of the very system of control that had defined galactic politics for generations, found itself forced into a position it had never anticipated needing to consider, reaching out to the species it had so casually discarded 6 weeks earlier. The message arrived on Earth 9 weeks after the original abandonment, carried through official Concord channels for the first time since the initial expulsion order. President Okonkwo read it standing in her office. General Webb and a small council of advisors gathered around her. The Concord Central Authority acknowledges the demonstrated resilience and military capability of the human species, the message read, the formal language unable to fully disguise the desperation underneath it. We propose renewed discussions regarding humanity's status within the Concord, with terms to be negotiated as full and equal members. Okonkwo set the message down and looked around the room at faces that had spent 6 weeks learning to survive without anyone's permission or protection. They want us back, Webb said, now that we've proven we don't need them. They want us back because they're afraid of what happens if we keep proving that to everyone else, Okonkwo corrected. The question is what we want. She thought of New Shenzhen, rebuilt and fortified, of Hawking's Reach, whose patient, unglamorous research had turned the tide of an entire war, of every colony and ship that had held the line, not because they were ordered to, but because humanity had made a promise and refused to break it, even when breaking it would have been so much easier. Send a response, Okonkwo said finally. Tell them we'll discuss terms, but tell them this too. Humanity does not return to a Concord that abandons its members when convenience demands it. If we rejoin, it will be as a founding voice in rewriting what that Concord actually protects, and who it's willing to leave behind. Months later, Admiral Sarah Chen stood once more on the Resolute's observation deck, looking out at a starfield that had once seemed indifferent and cold, 6 weeks of brutal, costly survival, having transformed it into something else entirely, a galaxy that finally understood exactly what it meant when humanity made a promise. Wei Lin had joined her for this visit, traveling from New Shenzhen to see firsthand the fleet that had saved her colony twice over the course of an impossible war. The 2 women stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars, before Wei Lin finally spoke. Do you think it's over? She asked. The fighting, I mean. No, Chen admitted. The hegemony lost a battle, not a war. The Concord's still figuring out what they actually want from us. There's a lot more uncertainty ahead than certainty. Then what was the point? Wei Lin asked. Of all of it. The losses, the sacrifice. Chen turned to look at her, the weight of 6 weeks settling into the lines of her face, but her eyes carrying something steady underneath the exhaustion. The point was proving something that should have always been true, she said. That worth isn't measured by how convenient you are to protect, that a promise means something even when, especially when, keeping it costs everything you have. The galaxy spent generations believing strength meant abandoning anyone who became inconvenient. We just spent 6 weeks proving them wrong. Far below them, scattered across 100 worlds and 1,000 ships, humanity continued the long, uncertain work of rebuilding what the war had cost, carrying forward the simple, stubborn principle that had carried them through an impossible 6 weeks. Nobody stands alone, not while there was still breath left to keep that promise. The galaxy had left them for dead. Humanity had simply refused to stay that way.